What is happening at the front? You're listening to the Explain Ukraine podcast. What is happening at the front of the Russo-Ukrainian war? Can Ukraine break Russian defense lines in the south? What are the key frontline spots and why are they important? How are drones changing the art of war? What arms does Ukraine need and how could they change the situation on the front line? The guest on this episode of the Explaining Ukraine podcast is Mykola Bielieskov, a Ukrainian military analyst, research fellow at Ukraine's National Institute for Strategic Studies and chief analyst at Come Back Alive, one of Ukraine's largest volunteer foundations. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the most reputable Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Patrons get exclusive content. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. Mykola Bielieskov, welcome to this podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
So there is, of course, lots of conversation about what is going on the front line right now, or what is with Ukrainian counteroffensive. There is also lots of publications in the international press that counteroffensive is going too slow and therefore people should rethink approach to it. There are good publications and bad publications. So let me ask, what do you think of it? What is going on the counteroffensive and what prospects does it have?
Well, with regards to counteroffensive, if you're talking what's going on in Zaporizhia region, in so-called Tokmak-Melitopol axis, the major development is Ukrainian attempt to enlarge the so-called bulge around Robotyne. So there is a number of settlements around Robotyne. It's Kopany, Novoprokopivka, Verbo, and Novofedorivka that the Ukrainians are pushing towards these settlements, trying to enlarge this so-called bulge, and in the process inflicting a major damage on the Russians and specifically destroying tube and rocket artillery, electronic warfare, and air defense system. So this is a process, but we shouldn't forget that there is another like Ukrainian attempts to move on, and they are taking place around Bakhmut. And recently we've had some local successes liberating Andriivka and Klishchiivka and pressing Russians to the east of these two settlements. So there are two processes ongoing, but of course the major axis is Tokmak-Melitopol. And with regards to the second part of your question about the prospects, and there is a very interesting situation. So there is expert consensus that the balance of attrition would be the most important factor. So who is able to inflict a major damage on the other side while preserving as much forces as possible. So everyone is saying this kind of thing, but no one is going to say when it's going to happen, when we are going to see the end result. Some people are emphasizing weather, but as for me, it's a bit secondary factor in the ongoing process, especially with the way of war we are waging that emphasize not a movement, not a swift movement, but destruction of specific weapon system, priority targets, and so on. So that's a very, very interesting situation. But it's natural because, as for me, people are asking too much out of military analysts, because people have in mind military analysts who mostly written analysis post factum when they knew result. And that's why for them it was much easier to reconstruct the process in reverse and to show all the major factors they played their role and so on. So that's why it's my kind ask out of everyone. So be a little bit more kind, more humble when you ask people about ongoing process. It's a natural.
You talk about the southern dimension, the southern vector, and I assume that people who listen to our podcast not necessarily understand why these two vectors are important, the southern and the eastern. So why this Ukrainian attack on such villages that you named like Robotene, with an idea of going more to the south, to the Sea of Azov. Why is it important?
This is the most promising direction in terms of hypothetical returns. So there is a lot of pros and little cons that directed us specifically at this part on the front line. So there is a lot of arable land. There is a Zaporizhia nuclear power station. There is a possibility, if we are successful in liberating fully Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, to be on the isthmus, and by this to strengthen our negotiation position, our bargaining position with regards to Crimea. There is, of course, the prospect of shortening the front line if we are successful. There is, that's why a lot of prospects, a lot of pros why we directed resources. The only problem is that it was also obvious to the Russians. So Russians might not be fighting that great, especially in offensive, but they still have officers, so-called officers, that are good at operational art, and they calculated rightly where Ukrainian next major strike is going to be, and that is the downside of all the pros, because they are also obvious to our enemy, and that is the major part of the front line upon the result on which the whole campaign depend, ongoing 2023 campaign depend. The situation that is going around Bakhmut is quite different one. So for Ukraine, it's an attempt to pin as much Russian forces as possible, while simultaneously concentrating major resources in the Zaporizhia. And we try to exploit the fact that the price of taking control of Bakhmut was that great for Russians, and despite the fact that the prospects of what we can gain is very limited, because there is only ruins of Bakhmut, unfortunately. But we exploit the symbolic importance of Bakhmut, and we try to pin as much Russian forces as possible. But it is games that two sides can play, unfortunately, and we've seen also Russian attempts to do the same kind of scenes, but to the north of Bakhmut, around Kupiansk, Svatove direction, and that's why this is a game that two sides can play.
Do I understand you correctly that the major strike of Ukrainians is the south, then Russians try to divert Ukrainian forces by attacking in Kharkiv region around Kupiansk, and then Ukrainians are trying to divert Russian forces by attacking in Bakhmut? Or maybe Bakhmut can be much more important for both Ukrainians and Russians than we think.
Well, even if we are successful around Bakhmut and we're able to push Russians out and regain control of Bakhmut, it's not as strategically important as recovering South mainland, for reasons I've named already. And yes, it's a interesting game with I would suppose more or less comparable forces, grouping of forces, when both try to disbalance the other side. And we are doing it not only around Bakhmut, but also in vicinity of Kherson, and the Russians are trying to do it around Kupiansk. But of course, it's not only about pinning down Ukrainian forces around Kupiansk. This direction is more promising, but luckily Russians, they don't have a major grouping of forces, because if Russians are successful around Kupiansk, it's not only replaying the results of Balaklia-Kupiansk offensive operation by Ukrainian forces, very successful last year operation, but it's also creating a flanking strike for the grouping of forces in precisely Zaporizhia region. That's why this in publications in Western media in the first part of August that said that, well, Ukraine distributed forces not that wisely and overemphasized Eastern Ukraine. As for me, it's a bit ungrounded, to put it mildly, because anyone who look at the map understands that if we don't defend Eastern Ukraine, and especially Kupiansk area, it means a major threat to our grouping of forces in Zaporizhia direction. That's why we need to balance these two directions, and that's a very interesting game both sides want to play. And as we see, no one is that much successful, because there is a tacit agreement between two sides that Tokmak-Melitopol direction is the most important, most consequential one, and everyone want to be successful in that direction despite attempts at other directions.
I know it's stupid a little bit to ask for forecasts, and you already said to be the modest when we talk to military analysts, but still, when you look at the progress of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the south, and about the idea of cutting the Russian troops in two parts in the south and going to the Sea of Azov, do you think it's realistic this year, next year?
I will put it in different ways because I don't like making forecasts. I mostly like to talk about tendencies, and forecast is very unpleasant and grateful business to do. I would say the following way. First, if we successful in pushing to environs of Tokmak till the end of this year, it would be very successful operation given all the constraints and objective conditions. And if we can defend this bulge that would be created, and if we strike Russians, because again, for attrition warfare, the most important thing is ammunition you have. Weather, of course, is important because there are some cloudy days that make it impossible to do aerial reconnaissance, but still. So we can strengthen this bulge, defend it, treat Russians as much as possible, especially these priority targets in their system of defense, and also in general make it difficult for them to regroup, and at the same time hone reserves, train reserves, and can return to this operation at the end of the first quarter, at the beginning of the second quarter of the next year. So there are still chances that the next year, if we are again provided with proper means, we would be successful. And that's precisely a very important thing to emphasize. So if the problem is lack of combat proficiency in Ukrainian forces, of course, it's very easy to direct criticism at Ukrainian forces. But there is nuances with regard to the training program. But if it's attrition warfare, the most important thing, where is the ammunition? And that's why it's about responsibility of our partners. Because let's be honest, we gained precious times. 18 months is a great amount of time, and that's why it's like transferring responsibility first and foremost on our partners. So that's why for attrition warfare, weather is not as important as for major swift maneuvers, and there is little prospect for them, and there is still a chance that we can take these positions around Tokmak, prepare and renew this offensive push, slow offensive push at the beginning of the next year, and finally push Russians out of the South mainland.
So next year, Russians had huge, outnumbering Ukrainians hugely in terms of ammunition, right? I was hearing the number, maybe you will correct me, about 60,000 shells per day. And now Russians are getting lower with this, while Ukrainians are getting more munition, including from the partners, and there is a kind of parity in artillery. Is that true? And what are the prospects in this warfare?
What I can say for sure is that in this offensive, our partners did it best, and the rate of fire is unprecedented from Ukrainian side. So 8,000 shells a day, it's the maximum, because in June last year, it was only 4,000 shells at best. Now it's two times much. But again, there is a difference in philosophies how we employ artillery. So Russians, they still emphasize mass, but we all alone emphasize precision. And that's why even if Russia is using more ammunition, and there was an assessment, very interesting one, that according to some sources, Russians are going to use approximately 7 million shells during 2023 campaign. So even if Russians are using more ammunition, it's not allowing for them to translate this bigger rate of consumption into results on the battlefield. So that is the current situation. And with regards to the prospect, 2024 would be the period of the most intense hunger shell for both sides, I would say, because Russia is facing problems in increasing ammunition production and both import from the North Korea. And also our partners, they need time to increase the amount of production of munition. So next year campaign would make both sides to improvise, to look for symmetrical solutions like VPV drones. And then situation might look different, especially for Ukraine, when at the beginning of the 2025, US would be able to produce sweeping 100,000 shells a month, and that's more than minimum requirement for Ukraine. So that's why next year would be difficult by both sides. But if we endure till 2025, it means that our minimal requirements, would be meted.
What about drones? Because initially, I had the impression that the focus of Ukrainian demands to partners was about, heavy equipment like armored vehicles, tanks, etc. Now we see that with these huge minefields that Russians have built, the tactics is changing. So it's about artillery, of course. It's about long-range artillery. It's about drones, very important thing. And it's about infantry. And am I correct saying that more important are now not tanks and armored vehicles, but drones plus artillery?
I would say that it was important all along. So from the day one, Ukraine emphasized precise artillery, and that's very unfortunate development that in the first months of this big war, like anti-tank weaponry was emphasized at the expense of artillery, despite the fact that improved artillery was the main factor that allowed us to foil Russian plans. Then, of course, there was big battle for Donbass, first big battle for Donbass, and then it was again artillery. And now, and in general, it's artillery war. If we are talking about this or that service, this or that segment of the armed forces, it's artillery war all along, with neither side being able to establish so-called superiority. That's why artillery bears disproportionate responsibility for inflicting a damage, destruction, and artillery is very important. That's why basically, if we want to understand the trajectory of this conflict, we need to keep in mind two things. First is the production rate, and then, of course, the way these munitions are employed. So this is important all along, and it's most important priority. And UAVs for them, again, to do precise fire instead of massive fire. UAVs are very important one. And that's very unfortunate development as for me that Ukraine and also Russia, both of them are relying on Chinese UAVs, not on Western UAVs, but on Chinese UAVs in a specific segment. That's very unfortunate development that our Western partners say don't possess this production capacity, proper one, to sustain us. So but drone sim is very tricky, complicated, and we can discuss it. I don't know for hours.
Let's try to discuss. So UAV, can you just decipher this word for our audience? Is it the same as drone?
Well, it's drone is more general for me because so-called autonomous unmanned platforms, they can be employed in different domains. There are unmanned surface vehicles employed successfully by Ukraine at sea. There are some ground platforms, despite their limitations, unmanned ground platforms. And there is, of course, segment of unmanned aerial vehicles, the biggest segment, the most widespread. And there are, of course, different UAVs in different niches. So there is UAVs employed for tactical reconnaissance. It's mostly Chinese drones produced by DJI. There is UAVs employed by so-called brigade artillery groups with for their reconnaissance at the depths of 20-25 kilometers. And we have our own indigenous examples of UAVs like Leleka 100. There is also some US-provided UAVs of this type like Puma. And there is so-called operational tactical UAVs we employ for reconnaissance at depths 65, 70, 80 kilometers. Again, we have Shark UAVs produced during this war, or PD-2 UAV, which we combine with HIMARS, because last year, for instance, there was the situation when we have HIMARS, but we don't have our own indigenous reconnaissance capability, and we relied greatly on our partners. And now we have Shark UAV, and as we see, there are different aerial vehicles on our side employed. There is, of course, a segment of so-called kamikaze UAVs. Unfortunately, Russians have, in some cases, more more important, more threatening types of weaponry like Lancet. With a range of 40 kilometers. There is, again, UAVs employed widely by both sides, the so-called first-person view UAVs that are combined with projectiles from the granite launchers that are quite successful. But the problem is that both sides understand the potential, and our initial developments in this field, they are more or less nullified because Russians are also employing them extensively. So this is the war that seen the most extensive employment UAVs in different roles, different dimensions, and it created the effect of persistent surveillance at the tactical level, at the operational tactical level, changing the understanding how you successfully wage war under conditions of persistent surveillance. Proving, of course, the tendencies we already see in other conflicts, but most visibly, we've seen such extensive deployment of UAVs changing war precisely in Russian-Ukraine big war.
UAV means unmanned aerial vehicle?
Right.
Right. So Ukrainians have been recently very successful in using them. We have all seen the information about attacks even in Moscow, right, in very long range targets. Recently, Ukrainians targeted the major Russian ship, which is called Minsk, right? Was it also with UAV or from rocket?
It was using... if our air forces are saying truth, again, they hinted that Scalp Storm Shadow was employed. And you've mentioned another segment of UAV, I forget, that are used for the so-called long-range strikes, for so-called strategic strikes. And yes, we also did a great success, a great progress that need to be emphasized, because there is unfortunately a huge asymmetry in this war, because war is going on Ukrainian territory. There is 850 kilometers active front line of fighting. Again, some of our territories are occupied. Russia is able to strike for the whole depths of Ukrainian territories, and unfortunately some of our partners, they impose unilateral constraints on Ukraine. And war, if you want to win, you need to transfer war on the enemy territory, and despite the constraints imposed on Ukraine, we improvise and we trying to transfer as much war as possible on Russian territories, destroying a whole set of targets. And again, it needs to be emphasized, we are destroying military-related targets. So we, unlike Russians, we are not targeting civilian infrastructure, critical infrastructure. We are strictly targeting military infrastructure. So we are targeting oil refineries and oil storage facilities. We are targeting military-industrial complex enterprises. We are targeting air defense system, as we've seen. We are targeting logistics, command and control. And of course, there is symbolic strikes as it happened with regards to Moscow. But mostly we are doing our best in terms of undermining Russian ability to generate, sustain, and employ grouping of forces, inter-service so-called grouping of forces employed against Ukraine. It's very important difference that need to be emphasized. And again, this whole idea that you can impose constraints on the one side that is doing a defensive operation, it's artificial. It's a nonsense. I'm sorry, it's a nonsense, and that's why we are overcoming these constraints. And the most important feature of this 2023 campaign is deeper and deeper strikes against Russian military-related targets, unlike in 2022, and we are moving in the right proper direction, because otherwise we don't have a chance to prevail. And it was emphasized last year, an article of Valery Zaluzhny and now his deputy Mikhailo Zabrodsky, that if you're not able to switch war to the other side, you'll never going to prevail.
Yeah, I do remember very well that article. Actually, it was really great. But the fact that Ukrainians are striking Russian territory under this ban of using Western weapons to strike Russian territory, that actually means that Ukrainians are striking Russian territory with its own weapons. And we have recently seen very much impressive things, which I already mentioned. And then there was a strike on the headquarters of the Black Sea, Russia still in Crimea. Can we say that Ukrainians are really doing well in terms of new technologies, in terms of developing their own long-range missiles, in terms of developing their UAV technologies?
Uh, yeah, some things they were constructed during this war. So there was no such products like Bober, Beaver before 24th of February. There was civilian employment of UJ-22, and we are trying to create the land attack version of anti-ship cruise missile Neptune. So some of these products, they were before the war, but now employed differently, or further developments, or strictly developed from scratch since the first day of the big war, and we are doing our best. Again, the only limitation is the production capacity and the subcomponents, because the situation is the following one. So both Ukraine and Russia, and of course our Western partners, all of us are scrambling for subcomponents from the same base, and you can't quickly increase the production capacity, and that is one of the bottlenecks. But we are doing our best, and we are creating for Russians real dilemmas, because some people are still trying to make sense what are the tasks. Luckily, our both what's going on in real life and some statement by our representatives, like representatives of main intelligence directorate, military intelligence of Ukraine, they are now emphasizing that one of our end goals is to create as much dilemmas for Russian air defense as possible, and make Russians think very hard where to place the air defense assets. Because yes, Russia is a country with the biggest amount of air defense assets, but the task they need to solve with this air defense asset is also huge. So they need to defend this inter-service group of forces. It's one thing. Another, temporarily occupied Crimea as a logistical base for the southern part of this grouping of forces, and Russia proper. And that's why we're actually creating the same dilemmas Russians created for us, because we also have this dilemma how to distribute air defense both to cover the frontline formation and the country. And that's also one of the things how situation changed in Ukrainian favor. For sure, it's not the progress on the land people expect, but it's really important development along with the strikes involving temporarily occupied Crimea. So when people don't see major changes on the front lines, that the front is not moving in Ukrainian favor, it doesn't mean that the tides of war are not moving in Ukrainian favor. There is a lot of evidence to prove otherwise.
When you look at the Western partners, we understand that how much we are dependent on not only on supplies but also on their capacity to produce. And there were lots of also conversation. I think it's Rheinmetall, the German company, is going to was suggesting to create production on the territory of Ukraine. So when you look into the future, first, do you see that Ukraine will be able to produce its own weapons under the situation when all the production capacities, facilities are actually targets for Russian missile strikes? And secondly, do you see the willingness and the certain changes in our partners that they are ready to, to sustainably produce as many weapons as Ukraine needs?
There is a lot of positive pieces of news with regards to military-industrial complex and the development of weaponry. It's not only about Rheinmetall, it's also about biosystems, it's also about, I suppose, Raytheon and Lockheed Martin that are producing air defense system, missile defense components. So a lot of entities, they demonstrate interest, and actually it's a part of model our partners to some extent chosen for us, because there is a model of NATO membership, but unfortunately our partners don't want to shoulder risk this way, and they emphasize increasing Ukrainian own capacity to defend itself, also through military-industrial complex cooperation. I hope we finally move out of the model of military-industrial complex we have for the 30 years of regaining independence, because mostly our military-industrial complex, it functioned as a kind of autarky, as a separate entity with no major connections, with no major production with Western entities. So that's why all the things align, and despite the fact that, yes, Russia theoretically is able to strike Ukraine through the whole depth of its territories, but our air defense is strengthening, And we know about the plans to produce as much as 15 batteries in some of NASAMS. Some of them we have already, some of them been produced by the US, but also by Canada. I mean, Canada is contracting this, or Norway is contracting. So air defense is strengthened, and we'll be able to guarantee these entities, protect them using surface-to-air missiles, also fighters. Our pilots are going to master soon at scale. So that's not a big problem. So we can remedy this threat, and that's the situations that we can tackle, and that's very important thing in this model of security. Our partners think about, have in mind when they talk about Ukraine. And I hope we finally be integrated into a Western military-industrial complex and follow the model of Poland, because Polish military-industrial complex, they didn't pretend that we can produce everything. They mostly sign a lot of contracts and then have some offset agreements to produce some components, and that is the model we should look at instead of thinking we can produce everything. So we can minimize the threat of missiles, and that is precisely, I hope we are going to see that there would be a lot of co-production, a lot of Western entities producing ammunition in Ukraine, producing platforms in Ukraine to fully realize Israeli model. But by the way, Israeli model, it's not only about deterrence capacity, but it's about ability to transfer war on the enemy territory, because that's why if you want to have Israeli model, as it was discussed in Western media, so please be comfortable with Ukrainian transferring war in enemy territory if enemy is so stupid to start another war.
Let me also ask about the fighter jets that you already mentioned. So there is a very long conversation about the fighter jets, in particular F-16. Why is it so much important for Ukraine right now? Why is Ukrainian stressing so much on this issue?
Because air domain is the most consequential one. So when this war started, if you look at the DoD reports, the first thing they always emphasize is that Russia is not able to establish air superiority, is not able to freely use piloted aviation. And that is a result of successful employment of the so-called air denial strategy, when you create a very high bar, a lot of risk for your enemy to use piloted aviation. Because piloted aviation is the most important, because all these missiles, UAVs, they are one-way things. So you shoot them and you need to produce it again, anew. But piloted aviation, if you establish air superiority and is able to use it freely, it means that you can continue to do this bombing campaign, as we've seen in Mariupol, unfortunately. So for Ukraine, it's important to continue this air denial strategy. And for air denial, you need both surface-to-air missiles, and luckily there is a lot of work done, or a lot of plans already published. But you also need fighters, because you're not able to create this shield all over Ukraine. There would be gaps around this surface-to-air missiles, because most of them has a range of up to 50 kilometers. Only Patriot is up to 100 kilometers. So there would be gaps in the surface-to-air missiles, and you need to cover them with fighter jets. And these fighter jets are important to deter Russian piloted aviation, both to come in depths of Ukrainian airspace, but also recently Russians, they improvised. They start to use the so-called aviation bombs, corrected aviation bombs, and it's a very crude analog of joint directed and munition extended range. So wings are attached, and the Russians are able to do a standoff strike. So they release this improvised munition, and then it fly like 40 kilometers, and then target any kind of land target. for tautology. And the Russians are actively employing them around Orikhovo, for instance, in Zaporizhia region. So it's about both creating and upholding as much risks for Russian piloted aviation. It's also about shooting down Russian cruise missiles, because radars of F-16s are much more powerful. They can track more targets simultaneously at bigger ranges, including cruise missiles, and also they have better air-to-air missiles with active radio homing, so-called, so they can strike these cruise missiles, and also they can keep at ranges as far as possible Russian piloted aviations that employ this very crude version of joint direct attack munition extended range.
Maybe my last question. Everybody now among our partners is, of course, afraid of the nuclear war. So the Russians, applying the nuclear weapons. What can you say to this fear?
It's you rightly framed it as for me. So Russia is already successful, unfortunately, to a certain extent, without employing this weaponry. And it's most potent weaponry in Russian arsenal, despite the fact that it's not used, because it had a major negative impact on shipment of weaponry. Some of them were postponed, some of them were provided in lower quantity or with restrictions. And despite the fact that luckily we have a major progress in weaponry capabilities, so we have green light for F-16s, we are on the verge of receiving short-range ballistic missile ATACMS. I'm sure that we are going to receive it after all these reports, but still it's working with regards to Ukraine NATO membership, and I don't know how to overcome this problem. So we need to credit Biden with, as I say, it's a nuclear emancipation of the threat of unconventional escalation employed by Russia, but still they have some potency, as we've seen with regard to question of Ukraine NATO membership. Usually when I asked, I say this way, so in Ukraine we are not fearful of anything, because we're not fearful both of tactical nukes, because in some instances you won't say for sure whether conventional munitions were used or tactical nukes were used to destroy. There is no Marinka, for instance, and looking at the rumbles and what is left out of Marinka, you can say what was employed, whether it's conventional munitions or tactical nuke or of the scales that was employed against Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And also Russian threat of strategic escalation with regard to Ukraine is not working, because this escalation dominance strategy employed by Russia, it's based on the following idea. So I'm going to scare my enemy given the existential stakes, but Ukraine is already waging an existential war. You can't make Ukraine to step back, threatening nuclear annihilation, when if we stay back, it's conventional annihilation. That's why in Ukrainian case it's not working, and we've seen it. The only problem is that it still have some impact on our partners' thinking, especially with regard to Ukraine NATO membership. And again, most people agree that it's a bluff, but no one is going to call this bluff. That's very unfortunate development, and really, I don't know, after more than a year of advocating, so don't be fearful. I don't know what to do to drive our partners to the idea. Don't be afraid. There is nothing Russia is going to do, especially as it would be a suicide for Putin, because even Russian partners, the countries that nominally take a neutral position, but actually it's more Russia-leaning position, even these countries like China, like India, they made clear that breaking nuclear taboo is not right thing. So if Putin do it, he would be a real pariah. And this is the thing he's precisely fearful, and he would be a real outcast. At that stage, no one is going to argue against regime change, against the one who breached nuclear taboo. But unfortunately, no one is going to call this bluff earnestly, and escalation management still very important consideration in policy pursued by Biden administration.
And truly, the last question: what does Ukraine need to win this war?
There is three factors. The first and most important thing is, of course, to preserve social cohesion inside Ukraine and Ukrainian readiness and will to fight. Because if this will to fight evaporate, for sure our partners will start to push us forcefully for negotiations. So the most important thing for us is to preserve this unity, because if we preserve it, no one is going to openly push Ukraine for negotiations, and the only other option is to increase the production capacity for the weaponry and munition. Another, of course, important factor is precisely this production of munitions, because mostly these 18 months were sustain us with the stock created during the peaceful times, and they still have a lot of work to do to increase this production capacity. And the last and most important thing is to pursue sound military strategy, because unfortunately escalation management, it's in total contravention to the sound military strategy, because sound military strategy is very simple and very very straightforward. So you need to destroy enemy to inflict a major damage quicker than enemy is able to regroup and recuperate. Unfortunately, escalation management, as we've seen, it's about risk taking, it's about being very cautious, probing attempts how enemy or opponent is going to respond. That's why a lot of opportunities were lost, valuable time was lost. Russia was able to regroup, Russia was able to create defense in depth. So the three things for Ukraine to win this war is internal cohesion, internal unity, more production capacity, and finally policy that emphasize sound military strategy instead of escalation management. If these three factors align, we're able to gain so-called strategic initiative and conduct at least one major offensive operation to encircle and destroy at least part of Russian grouping of forces, and by this to drive a message, to drive a lesson to the Russians that even like prolonging this war or stalemate is not an option. So please negotiate on a position of full restoration of Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Mykola Bielieskov, thank you for this podcast.
Thanks for interesting talk.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm a Ukrainian philosopher and chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the most reputable Ukrainian media NGOs. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. Patrons get exclusive content. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.